We recently had a question from one of the users on our forum as to how to do exploded bakes in Modo. I believe this user was using a kit. There's some great kits and plugins out there for things like this. One that comes to mind, of course, is William Vaughn's Hatchet toolkit, which is absolutely awesome. But I wanted to show you how to do this natively inside of Modo and using slightly different methods. Specifically also so you can more easily use things like Morse to do cage baking, but we're not going to be covering cage baking in this video. So as you can see here, I have this gun that is right at the origin of my scene, and if I turn off both my mesh layers, you can see that we actually have a high and a low. Now they're actually identical, but the difference is in how they're being shaded. The high mesh, if I go ahead and select my material here, is using our ever so popular rounded edge shader, and it has a rounded edge width applied to it, which if I come over here and I turn off the low mesh and I run a quick preview render, you can see that we get nice rounded edges on the corners, and people like to bake those in. So if I go ahead and come on over and let's right click on our high mesh and let's unmerge this mesh. We are separating the mesh out into all the various parts that we want to have that have not been welded together. And this allows for much easier exploded baking. And do the same with the low and go to unmerge mesh. I'll go ahead and turn that on. And let's go ahead and shift select everything. Did I get everything? Yes, I did. And drag that on up and give myself a little bit more room. Now I also tend to like having the low above the high, just because it makes my life easier. And in this case, I got very lucky. If you see here, if I select low and high, and low 2 and high 2, they actually corresponded in how they unmerged the meshes. Now, I just kind of got lucky in that respect. You may need to rename things appropriately. But I prefer having all my different mesh components split apart onto different item layers while I'm working, of course, just to make it easier to manage all these different items, and especially the relationships between high and low poly items. So now that we've done that, all we have to do is start dragging the high meshes onto the low meshes and dropping them into place. And this is automatically parenting the high underneath the low. And this is actually going to give us some nice aspects when we use the bake item later. Now I'm going to undo that really quickly because I did also forget something. If you'll notice, if I select the low mesh item and I press the W key, that shows me the center of my item and it's at the origin. And that's the case for every single mesh because of this unmerge function that we applied. If I go ahead and select one, followed by the rest, and I come over here to Edit, Center to Bounding Box, and Center, it now actually has centered the position for all the different mesh items. So if I come over here to high again and drag and drop my high mesh onto my low mesh, and there we go. We now have that parented in place, and you would want to go through and do this with all of your associated mesh items. Now I have everything parented, and I've checked to make sure that all my items correspond correctly, and I'm in the Game Tools tab. And the Game Tools tab has a lot of nice added extras, like for instance, you can use the timeline quickly and easily. And in this case, what I want to do is I actually want to set some keyframes on all my low items that have the high items parented to them. And so if I go ahead and pull this on up, I want to select, in this case, positions. And I'm going to go ahead and keyframe X, Y, and Z for every item just to make my life a little bit easier. I actually could just go ahead and keyframe X if I wanted to, just by selecting that alone. But I can select one item followed by the other, or one channel followed by the ones below it, and it will gang select all of them for me, which is pretty cool. So once I have channels selected, if I'm in item mode, I can hit the S key, and you can see it set a keyframe right here for me, which is super useful. And if I go ahead and advance the time by 1 frame, I can go ahead and start moving my meshes off place and setting up a basic exploded bake. Now, this of course could be achieved with some sort of scripting, something of that sort, to really make this go a lot faster. But it's also, in this case, there aren't too many items, so you can go ahead and do it manually. But however you want to, just make sure your items are spread out enough so that you don't get overlaps in your bake itself. So I've gone ahead and transformed all my different mesh layers into the position I want them in for an exploded bake. And you can see now that I can switch back to frame 0 or switch over to frame 1. And now I've got things nicely set up for the exploded bake that I am going to want to perform, right? Very nice. Okay, now I already expanded all these separate layers that we have here. And the reason why I did this is I don't actually want to have the high mesh layers visible. And so I could go ahead and just toggle them off here if I want to. And now the high mesh layers are not going to be visible, but they'll always follow along. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is we have some nice features in our bake item. And that's what we're going to be using to set up the bake for this model. So if I go ahead and come on over here to the shader tree, you'll see right here at the bottom, we have bake items. You'll need to come over here to the game tools, to baking, and you can go ahead and create a new texture bake item, and that will create a new texture bake item in your bake items right here. And what this allows for is persistent bake settings, especially if you're doing work like this, where you're actually trying to transfer from one mesh to another. In this case, transferring the rounded edge from the technically high-res mesh over to the low-res mesh as a baked normal map. So I've assigned my meshes to their respective target and source locations. And this is something that always confuses me. I always forget which is target and which is source in relation to high and low. Especially when I come back to a project, I still forget it. It's one of those things I just can't seem to retain. But one thing that makes life a little bit easier is you're able to select your low or high meshes inside the item list. And you see that the add selected button for each of these toggles off or on. And what this means is I have high selected right now. It is toggled on to be visible under source. That means high res meshes are part of target and low res are part of source. So important to understand, but if you forget it, like I always seem to, here's an easy way to remind you with an old project or one that's already set up. So I also have my distance set to 1.5 meters because it is a humongous weapon. It's like 16 feet long. And I have no cage because we're not talking about cages because the user isn't using a cage. Now, since our target, of course, is our high-res mesh, we want to be able to bake hidden targets because we have them not visible right now. And once we bake the normal map, this will make life easier for us because we won't see the two overlaying on top of each other, and we'll be able to just take a look at the low res with the normal map. Now, if I go ahead and come over to the shader tree, you can see that I have a normal map in place, and I can go ahead and add layer, image map, new image, and create the associated image that I need for a normal map. And if I toggle this on, I've actually already baked it. You can see quite nice job baking the rounded edge shader onto the surface. Now there's some other things to consider here as well. I have a 4K image. If I come into System and Preferences and take a look at my OpenGL settings under Display, I set my texture resolution to 4K. And the reason being is if you are displaying 2K, which is what the default is set to in Modo, but you bake the 4K map, you may see seams in the viewport, but if you rendered, you wouldn't actually see any, and it would look fine in your engine and stuff. But just to make sure that you understand this, when you're like, I have seams, check that out, make sure that that corresponds. And under final rendering, if you come down to your bake UV border size, I set that to 64. Set it super crazy high. When two islands start to cross each other, when the UV border size gets expanded, they terminate at directly 50% in between. And so this will make sure that your bakes come out much better, much cleaner. Now, once I've added this image here, I do have to visit my bake item, and I have to set my texture output to be that image, and also, of course, the effect needs to be set to normal. Now, one other last cool thing, if I take a look at my material settings, you'll notice that we actually have no rounded edge width on this high object. I'm going to set that to 25 millimeters, so we have that rounded edge. And also, if you take a look at even both of them, we have this option for use polygon area. And you can see how it changes things. If I have use polygon area off, that ends up giving you these kind of stretchy triangles here. And this is because if I go ahead and turn wireframe on, having lots of small polygons around much longer, stretchier polys, you end up with this kind of shading error. And so one quick and easy way to solve that is use polygon area, and you have much cleaner shading on your surface. Now, if I come over to my list view, one other thing that we're going to need to do, because I destroyed all the vertex normal maps on this mesh, is we're going to need to expand all my mesh items. And once they're all expanded, we'll select them all and actually assign a tangent basis map and a vertex normal map to all of these individual mesh items. So go ahead and select all of those, and underneath your vertex map menu in the game tools button for the game tools side menu, go ahead and come on down here to the bottom to mesh tangents, and we're going to go ahead and just create mctangents. That seems to generally work well with say for instance Unreal. And if we have that in place, you can see it's showing up underneath our list tab. And now I just want to go ahead and create a vertex normal map. You can do that in here. You also, just out of almost sheer habit, is come up to vertex map and set vertex normals. We're not going to set any custom normals with the vertex normal toolkit, which is awesome and would produce better results, but it'd be a much longer video and a video that is already going too long. And I have it set to use smoothing angle, which is using the smoothing settings that were part of the material properties, and that also includes using the polygon area. And so once that is in place, you can see that we have a nice clean weapon, and the normal map is actually on there currently. You can see our gun is much cleaner than it appeared just before. Now let's go ahead and you know what? I want to clear this image. I can do that easily by coming up over to the brush settings, come to utilities, and I can clear my image. And then my shading will go all sorts of wacky or just be nothing. Good, awesome. And I am also using Modo's default normal maps. You of course could, if you have the right material in place, change that to a Unity normal or an Unreal normal map. All right, so now that we have that in place, come to the bake item and properties, and let's go ahead and bake our selected map. Now this is a fairly large image, but I can see right now that I've got some color in it around the UV islands, which is very encouraging as far as telling me, yep, this looks like it was probably a good bake. And now my bake is complete. And if I go ahead and close that down, you can see the beautiful normal map that we have applied through baking in Modo. So you've learned a variety of things. Here are some custom techniques for exploded baking, some of the specifics with bake items, and some of the nuances you need to pay attention to while baking in Modo to make sure you are making certain you are seeing what you need to see. And one last thing, I'm going to come over here to my material options and use polygon area off. And you can actually see it makes no difference here. This is something that we have not spoken enough about because use polygon area is awesome. The one area I see on here that I don't like is some of the shading up here along this site. That could be improved considerably by using some of the vertex normal tools, but that is for a future video. All right, thanks a lot. Hope this was helpful. Have a great night, afternoon, morning, whatever it is for you. Later.